There's a peculiar quiet that settles over a home when something significant has shifted, even if no one has yet acknowledged it. That evening, as Beth prepared dinner, the sound of her movements in the kitchen felt muted, distant, as though an invisible barrier had risen between us. I sat at the table, staring at a half-empty glass of water, the weight of something unnamed pressing on my chest. "Mark," she called, her voice light but too casual, "can you set the table?" I didn't answer immediately. My thoughts were tangled, tracing back through the past few weeks. Beth had been different lately. Not drastically so, but enough that the subtle changes piled up into a nagging suspicion. She was quieter than usual, her laughter forced. She had started going for evening walks alone, something she'd never done before. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things. "Mark?" Her voice broke my reverie. "Sure," I said, rising to fetch the plates. The kitchen smelled of roasted chicken and herbs, a meal she knew I loved. Beth moved gracefully from counter to stove, her face calm, unreadable. I joined her by the counter, reaching for the plates she had just dried. As I handed them to her, her fingers brushed mine. She flinched slightly, so slight that most people wouldn't have noticed. But I did. "Everything okay?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. Her head snapped up, and for a fleeting moment, something flickered in her eyes. Guilt? Fear? I couldn't tell. "Of course," she replied, her tone too practiced. "Why wouldn't it be?" I didn't respond. The air between us felt heavy, loaded with words unspoken. As we sat down to eat, I studied her. She seemed almost too intent on enjoying the meal, her compliments to herself about the chicken overly enthusiastic. She avoided my gaze. The silence between us stretched, uncomfortable and accusing. I wanted to ask the questions burning in my mind, but I didn't know where to start. Something was wrong, but the shape of it eluded me, lingering just out of reach. I forced a smile. "Dinner's great, Beth." Her shoulders relaxed slightly, and she smiled back, but it didn't reach her eyes. That's when I knew. There was a truth she wasn't telling me, and it wouldn't stay hidden for long. The next morning dawned with a gray overcast sky, mirroring the unease that had settled in my mind. Beth was already up, her side of the bed cool to the touch. I found her in the kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee and staring out the window as if searching for something in the distance. "You're up early," I said, attempting a light tone. She turned slightly, offering a faint smile. "Couldn't sleep. Thought I'd get a head start on the day." I joined her at the counter, pouring myself a cup. The silence between us was palpable, filled with unspoken words and lingering tension from the night before. "Anything on your mind?" I ventured. She hesitated, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug. "Just the usual. Work's been stressful, and I've been feeling a bit off lately." I studied her profile, the way her hair fell softly over her shoulder, the slight furrow in her brow. "You know you can talk to me about anything, right?" She met my gaze briefly before looking away. "I know." The rest of the morning passed in a series of awkward exchanges and forced normalcy. As I left for work, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was a chasm widening between us, one that I didn't know how to bridge. At the office, I tried to immerse myself in tasks, but my concentration wavered. Around midday, I decided to call it quits and head home early, hoping maybe a spontaneous gesture might help ease whatever was troubling Beth. Pulling into the driveway, I noticed an unfamiliar car parked across the street. Something about it caught my attention, a sleek black sedan that seemed out of place in our neighborhood. I dismissed it as a visitor to one of the neighbors and went inside. "Beth?" I called out. No response. I walked through the house, noting the quiet. Her keys weren't on the hook by the door, and a quick glance into the garage confirmed her car was gone. I sighed, telling myself I should have called ahead. Heading into the kitchen, I spotted her phone lying on the countertop. It buzzed with a new message just as I picked it up to move it out of harm's way from a nearby puddle of water. I glanced at the screen instinctively. The message preview read, "Can't wait to see you again. Last night was." I stopped myself, a cold knot forming in my stomach. The sender's name was abbreviated, E. My mind raced. Who was E? With a shaking hand, I set the phone down. I knew it wasn't right to invade her privacy, but the nagging doubts demanded answers. Just then, the front door opened. Beth stepped in, carrying a grocery bag. Her eyes widened slightly upon seeing me. "Mark, you're home early." I forced a smile. "Thought I'd surprise you." She glanced toward the kitchen counter where her phone lay. "That's nice. Where were you?" I asked as casually as I could manage. "Just ran out to grab a few things for dinner," she replied, holding up the bag. An uncomfortable silence settled between us. I wanted to ask her about the message, about E, but I couldn't find the words without confessing I'd seen her phone. "Need any help with that?" I offered. She relaxed a bit. "Sure, thanks." We unpacked the groceries together, and for a moment, it felt almost normal. But beneath the surface, questions churned. As we prepared dinner, I decided to take a different approach. "I saw Ethan the other day," I said carefully. She froze for a split second before continuing to chop vegetables. "Oh. How's he doing?" "Seemed good. Mentioned he might stop by sometime soon." Beth nodded, her expression unreadable. "That would be nice." An idea formed in my mind. "Actually, why don't we invite him over this weekend? It's been a while since we've all caught up." She hesitated, her knife pausing midair. "I'm not sure that's a good idea." "Why not?" "Well, you know how things can be with family dinners, sometimes more stressful than enjoyable." I studied her face. "I thought you and Ethan got along well." She swallowed, her gaze fixed on the cutting board. "We do. I just think maybe another time would be better." Her reluctance only intensified my suspicions. "Beth, is everything okay between you two?" She finally looked at me, a mixture of frustration and something else in her eyes. "Why are you asking me that?" "I don't know. You just seem uneasy whenever I mention him." She set down the knife and took a deep breath. "Mark, I think you're reading into things. I'm just tired, and like I said, work has been stressful." I wanted to believe her, to push aside the doubts and trust in our marriage. But the signs were becoming harder to ignore. "All right," I said softly. "If you say so." That evening, after dinner, Beth went to bed early, claiming a headache. I stayed up, sitting in the dim light of the living room, grappling with my thoughts. The mysterious message, her evasiveness about Ethan, the unfamiliar car, it all pointed toward a conclusion I didn't want to accept. I pulled out my phone and contemplated calling my brother. Maybe I was overreacting. Perhaps there was a simple explanation. But as I scrolled through my contacts, I couldn't bring myself to press call. If my suspicions were wrong, I'd be sowing unnecessary discord. If they were right, I wasn't ready for that. Instead, I decided to pay closer attention, to gather more information before confronting either of them. The truth, whatever it was, would reveal itself in time. As I finally headed to bed, I glanced at Beth sleeping peacefully, her form illuminated by the soft glow of the moonlight filtering through the curtains. "Good night," I whispered, though she couldn't hear me. Lying beside her, sleep eluded me. The echoes of doubt reverberated in the silence, each unanswered question a weight on my chest. I knew the path ahead might lead to places I didn't want to go, but I couldn't turn back now. I needed to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The days that followed were a quiet test of endurance. I went about my routines, work, errands, helping the kids with their homework, but my mind never strayed far from the unease that had lodged itself in my chest. Beth seemed determined to act as if everything was normal, but her overly cheerful demeanor only fueled my suspicions. It was Thursday evening when the opportunity one had been waiting for presented itself. Beth announced she'd be heading out for another walk, her voice just a touch too casual. "I'll be back in an hour," she said, leaning in to kiss my cheek. I nodded, forcing a smile as I folded the laundry. "Enjoy yourself." As soon as the door clicked shut, I sprang into action. Grabbing my jacket, I waited a few moments before slipping out the door, careful to keep my distance as I followed her down the street. She walked briskly, her posture tense, and I struggled to remain unseen while keeping her in view. Beth turned a corner and headed into a small park at the edge of our neighborhood. My heart raced as I watched her scan the area before veering toward a secluded bench under a cluster of trees. I ducked behind a hedge, peering through the branches to see her pull out her phone. She glanced around nervously, then tapped out a message. Moments later, she looked up, her face brightening in a way I hadn't seen in months. My stomach churned. A figure emerged from the shadows, a man, his gait confident and familiar. Ethan. My younger brother. Beth stood to greet him, and the two exchanged a brief, hesitant embrace. They sat on the bench, their heads close as they spoke in low voices. I couldn't make out the words, but their body language spoke volumes. I wanted to burst out from my hiding spot, demand answers, but I couldn't move. My feet felt rooted to the ground, my breath shallow. The scene before me didn't just confirm my worst fears, it shattered something deep inside me. After what felt like an eternity, Ethan handed Beth an envelope. She slipped it into her purse and hugged him again, longer this time. Then they parted ways, Ethan heading back the way he'd come while Beth lingered on the bench, her hands trembling as she stared at the envelope. Once Ethan was out of sight, I slipped away, making sure Beth wouldn't notice me as I hurried home. I sat in the living room, my thoughts spiraling. What had I just witnessed? When Beth returned, her face was flushed, her breath slightly uneven. She froze when she saw me sitting in the armchair, watching her. "You're back early," she said, her voice laced with unease. "Decided to call it a night," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "How was your walk?" "Good," she said too quickly. "It's nice to get some fresh air." I nodded, saying nothing more. Her eyes darted toward her purse, where the envelope undoubtedly lay hidden. That night, as Beth slept beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The truth was coming into focus, but I still didn't understand the full picture. Why Ethan? Why now? The next step was clear. If I wanted answers, I couldn't wait for them to come to me. I had to confront Ethan, face to face, and demand the truth. The confrontation with Ethan would have to wait. The following evening brought with it a storm, both outside and within the walls of our home. Thunder growled in the distance as Beth and I sat in tense silence at the dinner table, the kids obliviously chattering away about their day at school. "Mom, are we still going to the park tomorrow?" Natalie, our eldest, asked as she poked at her mashed potatoes. Beth's smile was faint, distracted. "We'll see how the weather is, sweetheart." I caught her gaze briefly, and she quickly looked away. The weight of unspoken words between us was unbearable. After dinner, Beth busied herself with clearing the table while I helped Mark Jr. with a puzzle in the living room. The storm outside was growing stronger, rain lashing against the windows. "Daddy, look!" Mark Jr. exclaimed as he held up a completed corner of the puzzle. I smiled and ruffled his hair. "Good job, buddy." The house felt unnervingly quiet after the kids went to bed. Beth retreated upstairs, claiming a headache, and I found myself wandering the dimly lit living room, replaying the events of the past few days in my mind. As I passed beneath the chandelier that hung over the dining table, the house gave a sudden groan, a sound I'd learned to associate with the stormy weather shifting the old beams. A bolt of lightning lit the room, and I froze as the chandelier above me swayed precariously. "Mark?" Beth called from upstairs, her voice tinged with unease. Before I could answer, a loud crack echoed through the house. My eyes shot upward as the chandelier broke free from its mount. Time seemed to slow as the heavy fixture plummeted, shattering against the dining table with a deafening crash. Mark! Beth's footsteps thundered down the stairs, her face pale with alarm. What happened? I stood amidst the debris, shards of glass and twisted metal strewn across the floor. The chandelier, I managed, my voice shaking. It just fell. She approached cautiously, her eyes darting between me and the wreckage. Are you hurt? I'm fine, I said, brushing off her concern. It's just the table. Beth's gaze lingered on me, searching for something in my expression. For a moment, I thought she might say more, but she simply sighed and began picking up the larger pieces of glass. The storm outside seemed to intensify, lightning illuminating her face as she worked. For the first time in days, I saw a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes, a crack in the wall she'd built around herself. I'll clean this up, I said, taking the broom from her hands. You should go rest. She hesitated before nodding. Okay. Thank you. As she retreated upstairs, I began sweeping the fragments into a dustpan. The storm roared louder, rattling the windows, but the real tempest was brewing within me. The chandelier wasn't the only thing that had come crashing down tonight. Whatever fragile illusion of normalcy we'd been clinging to had shattered with it. And just like the shards scattered across the floor, I knew there would be no putting it back together. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the air crisp and cool. The house felt eerily quiet as I stood in the kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee and staring at the pile of debris where the chandelier had fallen. Beth had avoided me all morning, retreating into our bedroom with the excuse of sorting through old clothes. I couldn't shake the image of her and Ethan in the park, the envelope she had taken with trembling hands. The questions swirled endlessly in my mind, and my resolve to confront Ethan only grew stronger. By mid-afternoon, Beth emerged, her hair tied back and her face pale but determined. I'm going to take the kids to the park for a while, she said, avoiding my eyes. That's fine, I replied. I've got some things to take care of here. She hesitated briefly, then called for the kids, her voice tight. I watched from the window as they piled into the car and drove off. The house was silent again, the emptiness pressing against my chest. I decided it was time. I grabbed my keys and headed for Ethan's apartment. The drive was short, but it felt endless. My mind raced with scenarios of what I might find, of what I would say. When I arrived, I found his door ajar, a faint creak echoing as it swayed in the breeze. Ethan. I called out, stepping inside cautiously. The apartment was small, sparsely furnished, and eerily quiet. As I moved through the living room, I noticed a faint trail of muddy footprints leading toward the balcony. My pulse quickened. Ethan. I called again, louder this time. A rustling sound came from the balcony, and I stepped outside. There he was, perched precariously on the edge of the railing, his back to me. Ethan. I shouted, panic seizing me. What the hell are you doing? He turned slowly, his face a mask of despair. His usually confident demeanor was replaced with something raw, broken. Mark, he said hoarsely, you shouldn't be here. I took a step closer, my heart pounding. What's going on? What's all this about? His eyes flickered with guilt, and he shook his head. You wouldn't understand. Try me, I demanded, my voice firm. Before he could respond, his foot slipped on the wet railing, his arms flailing as he tried to regain his balance. My body reacted instinctively. Ethan. I lunged forward, grabbing his wrist just as he toppled backward. For a terrifying moment, we teetered on the edge, my grip the only thing keeping him from falling 3 stories. He stared up at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and shame. Don't let go, he pleaded, his voice trembling. I've got you, I grunted, straining to pull him back. With one final heave, I managed to haul him over the railing and onto the balcony floor. We both sat there, breathing heavily, the weight of the moment pressing down on us. "What were you thinking?" I demanded, my voice shaking with anger and fear. He buried his face in his hands. "You don't understand, Mark. I've messed everything up. I've ruined everything." "Then tell me," I said, my tone softer now. "Tell me what's going on." Ethan looked at me, his eyes brimming with tears. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. It just got out of control." My stomach sank. I knew he was talking about Beth. "What did you do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He hesitated, his hands trembling. Beth and I. It wasn't supposed to mean anything. The words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Go on." Ethan swallowed hard. "I'll tell you everything, but not here. Not like this." I nodded, my mind reeling. "All right. Let's talk inside." As we moved back into the apartment, I couldn't help but glance at the balcony railing. The image of Ethan dangling there was burned into my mind, a stark reminder of how close things had come to an even greater tragedy. The truth was about to come out, and I wasn't sure I was ready to hear it. Ethan sat slumped on the couch, his head in his hands, while I paced the length of the room. The air was thick with tension, and I struggled to contain the whirlwind of emotions surging through me: anger, betrayal, confusion. "You said it didn't mean anything," I began, my voice sharp. "But how does something like this just happen? How do you betray your own brother?" Ethan looked up, his face pale, his eyes rimmed with guilt. "It started a few months ago," he said, his voice barely audible. "I didn't plan for it. Neither of us did." I stopped pacing, turning to glare at him. "Then what happened?" He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "Beth reached out to me. She said she needed someone to talk to, that she felt disconnected from you. I thought I was helping." "I thought." "You thought what?" I snapped. "That sneaking around behind my back was helping." Ethan flinched but didn't defend himself. "It wasn't supposed to go this far," he murmured. "We didn't mean to hurt you." I let out a bitter laugh, the sound harsh even to my ears. "You didn't mean to hurt me? Then what the hell did you think would happen?" As the words left my mouth, the tension in the room seemed to crystallize. A sudden gust of wind slammed against the apartment, rattling the windows. Before either of us could react, one of the large living room panes cracked and then shattered, sending shards of glass cascading onto the floor. Ethan jumped to his feet, instinctively shielding his face. I stood frozen, watching the shards glint in the light like fractured stars scattered across the floor. "Damn storm," Ethan muttered, his voice shaking as he brushed a piece of glass off his sleeve. But the storm outside was nothing compared to the tempest brewing within me. The broken window felt symbolic, a physical manifestation of the fractures that had splintered our family. Ethan began picking up the larger pieces of glass, his hands trembling. "Mark, I never wanted it to be like this." I crossed the room, my hands clenching and unclenching at my sides. "Did you love her?" He froze, the question hanging heavily in the air. Slowly, he looked up at me, his expression pained. "No," he said finally. "It wasn't love. It was. I don't even know what it was. A mistake. A terrible, stupid mistake." "Did she love you?" I pressed, my voice colder now. Ethan shook his head. "She said she didn't. She always talked about how much she loved you, how she wanted to make things right. But she needed something, and I." "You what?" I cut him off. "You decided to give her what she needed because you thought I couldn't." "I don't know." Ethan's voice cracked, raw with emotion. "I was an idiot, Mark. I thought I was helping, and then I couldn't stop. I've ruined everything, and I don't know how to fix it. I turned away, staring out through the jagged opening where the window had been. The wind rushed in, chilling the room, but I barely noticed. There was no fixing this. Ethan had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and Beth. The image of her sitting with him in the park, the envelope in her hands, flashed in my mind. I turned back to Ethan. What was in the envelope? His face paled further. I don't know. Don't lie to me, I warned, my voice like steel. Ethan hesitated, then let out a long sigh. She said it was a letter she'd written to you. About us. She wanted to explain everything but didn't know how to say it face to face. The revelation struck me like a blow. So she thought putting it in writing would make it easier? I guess, Ethan said weakly. She said she wasn't ready to give it to you yet. That's why she had me hold on to it. I stared at him, the weight of his words settling in my chest. Beth had been planning to tell me all along, but not directly. She'd given the truth to Ethan, the very person she'd betrayed me with. The storm outside howled, and the broken window let the wind carry its eerie wail into the room. It sounded almost like a lament, a mourning for what had been lost. I stepped toward the door, my mind made up. Where's the letter now? Ethan's eyes widened in alarm. Mark, wait. Where is it? I demanded. He hesitated, then pointed toward a small drawer in the corner of the room. Without another word, I strode over and yanked it open. There it was, an envelope with my name written in Beth's familiar handwriting. I held it in my hands, the storm raging both outside and within me. The truth was finally within reach, but I hesitated, unsure if I was ready to face it. The envelope felt heavy in my hands, though it was just paper. Ethan stood across the room, his shoulders slumped, watching me with a mixture of guilt and dread. You should read it, he said quietly. I didn't respond. Instead, I tore the envelope open with unsteady fingers. Beth's handwriting filled the page, neat but rushed, her words pouring out in a way that felt desperate. Mark. I don't know how to start this. I never meant for any of this to happen. I never meant to hurt you. The storm outside quieted as I read, but the storm inside me raged. Her words spoke of loneliness, of feeling invisible, of a need to feel wanted. She admitted to her affair with Ethan, calling it a mistake, yet rationalizing it as something she thought she needed to find herself. The letter ended with a plea. Please don't hate me. I love you, Mark. I want to fix this. Tell me how. I folded the letter and looked at Ethan, who hadn't moved. She says she loves me, I said flatly. She does, he replied, his voice hoarse. She never stopped. The words rang hollow. The letter may have been written for me, but it was a confession, not an apology. And now, I had to decide what to do with the truth I'd uncovered. By the time I returned home, the wind had died down, leaving an oppressive stillness in its wake. The letter sat folded in my pocket, its words a weight I couldn't ignore. Beth was in the living room, pacing nervously. She froze when she saw me, her face pale. You went to see him, she said softly. I nodded. I know everything. Tears welled in her eyes. Mark, Don't, I interrupted, holding up a hand. I don't want excuses. Her lip trembled. I made a mistake. I thought I needed something I wasn't getting, but I was wrong. I love you, Mark. I want to make this right. I looked at her, searching for the woman I had married. She seemed so small, so fragile. But the storm in my chest hadn't passed, it swirled, dark and unyielding. You say you love me, I said quietly. But love doesn't look like this, Beth. It doesn't destroy. She stepped closer, desperation in her eyes. Please, Mark. I'll do anything. Just give me a chance to fix this. Outside, the storm clouds gathered again, the wind picking up once more. I turned away from her, staring out the window as raindrops began to fall. Sometimes, I said, my voice steady but heavy, a storm leaves too much damage behind. You can rebuild, but it will never be the same. The tears spilled down her cheeks as the storm outside mirrored the one within us. I didn't know if I could forgive her, if there was a way forward. But one thing was certain, the calm we once had was gone, replaced by the echo of thunder that would linger for a long time. The end.